Jake had always found suburban life reassuring: tranquil mornings, friendly waves from neighbors, and the comforting hum of sprinklers in well-tended lawns. There was a shared understanding in his cul-de-sac, boundaries were respected, and if a dispute arose, it usually ended over a polite chat and perhaps a round of lemonade. Karen's arrival disrupted that balance in ways Jake couldn't have predicted. When she first moved in next door, she appeared pleasant enough. She smiled broadly, chatted about how wonderful the neighborhood looked, and passed out homemade flyers listing her contact info in case anyone needed a hand. It took only a few weeks for people to discover that under her polite exterior lurked an officious meddler who saw other residents' business as her personal playground. She left notes on driveways if guests parked unevenly, complained about children playing too loudly, and glared at anyone who dared drag their trash can to the curb a minute too soon. Even then, Jake had hoped it was all a misunderstanding, maybe she was just particular. He believed that neighborly harmony would prevail, or so he told himself, until the morning he discovered a neatly drilled hole in his fence. He noticed it while mowing his lawn. The mower's roar died down for a moment, and he caught a glint of sunlight reflecting on something peculiar. He switched off the machine and knelt down to inspect. A small, round opening had been carved into the wooden plank, at around adult eye level. Fresh sawdust still clung to the blades of grass beneath it, which sent an uneasy chill down Jake's spine. He pressed his face near the fence and peered through, glimpsing Karen's flower pots on the other side. The vantage point was deliberate. That detail struck him as deeply invasive. Who would need to peer so precisely through the fence? His mind latched onto one suspect, and that suspicion only grew when he spotted the faint outline of footprints in the soil, leading from Karen's property to the fence line. More baffling was the question of why. Did she crave gossip? Want something to report to the homeowners association? Jake had heard of petty neighborhood spats, but drilling holes to spy seemed like an extreme measure. Caught between anger and bewilderment, he decided the diplomatic route was best. That afternoon, he walked up to Karen's door, wearing his friendliest expression. She opened with her usual bright smile, though her eyes flashed wariness when she saw who it was. He explained, calmly, that he'd found a strange hole in the fence, asked if she might know anything about it, and added that he was concerned about property rights and privacy issues. Her face went blank for half a second before morphing into a mask of feigned innocence. She shrugged, claiming ignorance, suggesting maybe the fence was old or riddled with wood rot. Then, she offered the unhelpful advice that if it bothered him so much, he could patch it himself. The dismissive tone stung Jake more than the words themselves. He tried to press gently, explaining it looked newly drilled, but Karen cut him off with a sing-song laugh. She declared she had better things to do than worry about holes in fences and shut the door. A cursory glance at her porch revealed a cordless drill resting on a side table, a detail that did nothing to dispel his suspicions. Jake felt his skin prickle with annoyance. Her attitude suggested she wouldn't just stop at a single hole, especially if she had found a twisted sense of power in peering into other people's business. Over the next few days, he discreetly watched from his windows whenever he heard unusual sounds from her property. Whenever Karen stepped into her yard, she cast long glances at his fence, especially at the newly exposed patch. One evening, he caught a glimpse of her leaning over, pressing her ear against the boards. Anger surged within him, but he held back, thinking it unwise to start a screaming match with no concrete evidence. Even so, the sense of violation weighed heavily on him. He found himself hesitating to go about his normal routines, watering the flowers, grilling on the patio, or even opening his curtains at night, out of fear that a watchful eye might be tracking his every move. Spurred by this growing paranoia, Jake installed a small security camera angled at the problem area. He hoped it would serve a dual purpose: deter Karen from meddling further and, if she persisted, record the trespass. The camera was discreet, something an average passerby wouldn't notice unless searching for it. For a while, nothing happened. Days slipped by, and he began to question whether he'd overreacted. Perhaps the hole was a fluke, or maybe Karen realized it was a terrible idea. He almost convinced himself it would blow over. Then, on a balmy Tuesday afternoon, he reviewed the camera footage out of curiosity and saw exactly what he feared: Karen, drill in hand, fiddling with the fence while scanning the perimeter. She didn't look frantic or rushed. Instead, she moved with a calm determination, widening or refining the hole as though perfecting her little peephole project. Jake felt his heart thunder in his chest. This was no misunderstanding. She was blatantly violating his privacy. He replayed the footage, capturing screenshots as proof. He planned to confront her again, with evidence in hand, but realized a second standoff at her doorstep might escalate into a shouting match that solved nothing. Furthermore, if she was willing to spy on him, who knew what else she might try? He contacted the homeowners association instead, sending them the clearest snippet of video along with a concise email explaining the situation. Their reply was polite but vague, promising to look into it. Frustration gnawed at Jake. He needed something more concrete than a half-hearted reassurance. With the evidence secured, he resolved to keep an eye on the fence and wait for the association's next step. In the meantime, he decided to block the hole from his side, sealing it with a small wooden patch. That act triggered Karen's fury. He heard her yelling through the fence a day later, insisting he was interfering with necessary inspections. She offered no explanation of what, exactly, she needed to inspect. Her voice carried that authoritarian edge that had already soured her reputation among the neighbors. Jake's frustration spiked when, the following week, he received a letter summoning him to an HOA hearing. The notice stated there had been a complaint about unauthorized alterations to a shared fence, and that he might be required to remove the new addition if it contravened any guidelines. He stared at the paper in disbelief, realizing Karen had beaten him to the punch. She'd filed some twisted complaint against him, flipping the story to make it seem like he was in the wrong. Anger bubbled up like a volcano. Yet, he took a deep breath. Perhaps this hearing would be the perfect venue to showcase the footage of her drilling. Let her try to explain that away. A sense of grim resolve settled in. He organized his screenshots, downloaded the raw footage, and even took close-up photos of the hole itself. If Karen wanted a fight, she'd get one, but he'd fight with facts, not empty words. Jake arrived at the small meeting hall for the HOA hearing braced for hostility. He recognized a few board members who seemed cordial enough, but tension hung in the air. Word of the fence drama had spread through the neighborhood, and a few curious neighbors had shown up, eager to see how the saga would unfold. Karen was already there, flipping through a folder of papers, lips pursed in an irritated frown. She glanced up only briefly when Jake entered, and the look she gave him was ice cold. The board opened the session by reading Karen's complaint that Jake had performed unapproved modifications on a fence that potentially bordered shared property. She sat up straighter, as if ready to relish his humiliation. But then the board asked Jake if he had any rebuttal or evidence to present. He calmly nodded, set his laptop on the table, and loaded a short clip. Before pressing play, he explained the timeline, discovering the hole, asking Karen about it, receiving a brush-off, and then installing a camera. The board seemed polite but reserved, as if they had heard thousands of petty quarrels before and expected little substance. When the video began, though, their expressions changed. It showed Karen, her posture unmistakable, leaning against the fence with a drill. The footage was clear enough to remove any doubt that she was the one making adjustments. A collective gasp rippled through the small audience. Karen's face turned a splotchy red, and her lips formed a thin line. One of the board members paused the video, blinking in surprise. Another asked Karen point-blank why she was drilling a hole in her neighbor's fence. She tried to stammer something about checking for wood rot or potential hazards that might affect property values, but the stuttering made her sound unconvincing. Still, Karen had a knack for doubling down. She insisted the hole had been there all along and that Jake's footage was misleading. Maybe she was just removing a jagged edge. Jake responded by showing before and after shots, highlighting how the hole's diameter changed from one day to the next. The board asked her if she had permission to modify her neighbor's fence. She pivoted, claiming the fence was partially on her property line and that she had every right to ensure it wasn't an eyesore. It was a slippery argument at best. Another board member asked if she had a professional survey to prove the fence sat on her land. Karen fumbled, saying she had no official document but common sense told her the boundary was in her favor. She looked around the room, searching for support, but found only skeptical stares. Things took a more serious turn when Jake presented the final clip, a nighttime view in which Karen seemed to be adjusting something near the newly installed patch on Jake's side. She was leaning over with a small flashlight, apparently trying to pry the patch off. That crossed the line from questionable maintenance to outright trespassing. Suddenly, the discussion in the room pivoted from petty neighborly spats to serious boundary violations. Karen's eyes flicked wildly as though she might leap up and snatch the laptop. Instead, she sneered that Jake had no right to film her yard. The board members calmly pointed out that it was his fence line being recorded, and that the law generally allowed cameras facing one's own property. Another neighbor testified that Karen had been seen prowling around at odd hours, refusing to say what she was doing. The hearing's conclusion grew inevitable. The board found Karen's complaint baseless, admonished her for unauthorized drilling, and told her she might face fines if she continued. She would need to reimburse Jake for any damage to his fence. Jake let out a sigh of relief, imagining that would mark the final chapter of this bizarre ordeal. But Karen did not slink away in shame. Over the subsequent days, she paced her yard like a general plotting a counterattack. Rumors circulated that she was gathering evidence of other supposed code violations, picky nonsense like the color of Jake's shed or the style of his gutter drains. Occasionally, she'd shoot venomous glares across the fence, as if daring him to slip up. Jake tried to maintain normalcy. He trimmed his hedges, had friends over for a weekend barbecue, and reminded himself that the HOA had sided with him. Yet the tension lingered. He found a suspicious footprint near his garden beds one morning, though no camera footage captured who made it. He started to wonder if Karen was stalking him after dark. One night, a loud clattering jolted Jake awake. He rushed outside to find his trash bins overturned. At first, he assumed a stray cat or raccoon was the culprit. But then he spotted faint tire marks on the side street near his driveway. He checked his security feed. The resolution wasn't perfect, but he could make out a car suspiciously slowing down near his place before speeding off. The next day, Karen swung by under the guise of small talk with another neighbor. Overhearing her mention someone's trash might become a health hazard if left out too long, he had to clamp his jaw shut to avoid an outburst. Her message was clear: she intended to pester him any way she could. The more cornered she felt, the more vindictive she became. Jake soon learned that Karen had gone behind his back to file a new complaint at the local zoning office. She alleged that his fence was illegally high, violating municipal codes, and that his yard structures threatened the neighborhood's aesthetics. The official notice arrived in his mailbox, thick with forms requiring him to prove compliance. If she was hoping to bury him in red tape, it almost worked. He spent hours combing through county guidelines, documenting the height of his fence, and listing every change he'd made since moving in. Exhausted and irritated, he discovered an obscure clause that might technically require a minor permit for the metal cover he used to block the hole. Though it was a moot point, no official had ever enforced it. Karen's sudden crusade forced him to jump through hoops. He realized she'd found a way to escalate the fight without physically trespassing. In a sense, her strategy worked. Jake lost sleep over deadlines, dealing with forms, and scheduling an inspection that came at an inconvenient time. He had to push back a work meeting, incurring the ire of his boss. Meanwhile, Karen seemed almost cheerful whenever he glimpsed her. She hosted loud coffee gatherings on her porch, pointedly ignoring him yet speaking in an exaggerated voice about neighbors who don't follow the rules. Some locals shrugged it off, but others, particularly those who didn't know the fence saga, began to eye Jake with mild suspicion. Feeling cornered, he pressed the HOA again to intervene. They sympathized but claimed their jurisdiction only went so far. The zoning office operated independently. He was on his own for that battle. A break finally came when the zoning inspector paid a visit. The official, a calm woman in a city-issued polo, walked the perimeter of Jake's property with a checklist in hand. She measured the fence meticulously, examined the patch, and took photos for her records. After a tense half-hour, she told Jake everything looked fine. He just needed to pay a small administrative fee for the modification. Hardly an earth-shattering penalty. She also revealed, in a rare moment of candor, that Karen had been to the office multiple times, lodging complaints about minor details like paint color and landscaping variety. She's quite persistent, the inspector noted diplomatically, before confirming there was nothing else to worry about. Feeling vindicated, Jake thanked her and escorted her out, relieved the paperwork headache was almost over. Still, Karen didn't let up. She doubled down on her personal vendetta in the neighborhood forum, accusing Jake of covert surveillance and stirring up feuds with baseless allegations. Interestingly, though, her posts garnered more ridicule than support. People had grown tired of her meddling, and a few brave souls chimed in with their own experiences of her intrusion. One family recounted how she demanded to see their backyard after hearing suspicious sounds at night. Another recalled that she once scolded a teenager for wearing loud shoes on the sidewalk. The anecdotes painted a clear picture. Karen had long been overstepping boundaries, and the fence fiasco was the boiling point. Emboldened by these shared stories, Jake politely responded to her forum rants with evidence from the HOA hearing. Links to the official notes showed that she was found at fault. Karen's responses fizzled out under the weight of facts. For a moment, Jake hoped that might mark a turning point. But Karen had one more move to play. Under the cover of early morning darkness, she arranged a property line survey on her own. A couple of workers appeared with measuring tools, placing flags in the ground near Jake's fence, as if searching for an inch or two that might belong to her. Jake watched from his window, uneasy. If the survey concluded that part of the fence actually stood on her land, she might force him to take it down, drilled hole or not. The tension spiked again, reminiscent of the hearing's build-up. After all, if she could prove a boundary error, perhaps her drilling was partially permissible. Jake quietly documented every step. He filmed the workers, politely greeting them to learn who hired them, and they openly admitted Karen was paying for the private survey. She hovered in the background, arms folded, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. Jake's stomach twisted with anxiety. He couldn't shake the feeling she might have found a cunning loophole. Days later, an unexpected letter arrived, for Karen, mistakenly placed in Jake's mailbox. He saw the return address from the surveying company and felt a surge of curiosity. Morally torn, he hesitated, but the suspicion that Karen might spring a sudden legal demand tugged at him. He reasoned that opening it was improper, he wasn't that petty, so he taped it closed and delivered it to Karen personally. She snatched it from him, her face flushed, and mumbled something about finally proving who's right. The result came out soon after. At a neighborhood gathering, Jake overheard Karen hissing to a friend that the survey found no meaningful encroachment. The fence was almost exactly on the proper line. If anything, a tiny corner of her deck extended onto shared ground, which could raise concerns for her own compliance. Realizing her final gambit had backfired, Karen stormed away from the gathering in a huff. The rumor mill quickly churned. She was furious, out hundreds of dollars for the survey, and still stuck with the stigma of being the local nuisance. Late one evening, not long after the failed survey, the entire block was awakened by the wail of sirens. Red and blue lights danced along the cul-de-sac, sending residents outside in pajamas and slippers to investigate. A police car and an ambulance were parked in front of Karen's home. Hearts pounded as people speculated, had there been a break-in, an accident, or something more sinister? Jake stepped onto his porch, phone in hand, worried for everyone's safety despite the tension with Karen. He lingered at a respectful distance while officers moved in and out of her house. A neighbor whispered that Karen had made a frantic call about an intruder in her backyard. After thorough checks, though, the police found no sign of forced entry. A paramedic eventually emerged from the house, shaking her head and noting Karen had suffered a panic attack. The medics left soon after, concluding the crisis was more psychological than physical. Some onlookers traded perplexed glances. The unexpected emergency made Jake reflect on how far this feud had gone. He wondered if Karen had genuinely believed someone was trespassing, perhaps her own guilt over drilling holes had triggered paranoia. Or maybe it was another scheme, a dramatic bid for sympathy. In any case, the incident seemed to unnerve Karen. She stopped hurling public accusations for a while, venturing out less often. In her rare appearances, she wore a haunted look. Weeks crawled by with an uneasy quiet. Neighbors tried to remain cordial, but a tangible barrier separated her from the rest. Then, suddenly, a "for sale" sign sprouted on her lawn, bright letters declaring a motivated seller. People speculated that maybe Karen's meltdown led her to move. Others suggested the HOA fines and the endless disputes had worn her down. Jake, cautious as ever, hoped it wasn't a trick but sensed relief on the horizon. Amid the swirl of rumors, Karen's property listing lingered longer than average. Prospective buyers came by, often leaving swiftly. Some recognized her name from local gossip. The house might have been attractive, but no one wanted to inherit her baggage. Eventually, a price drop sign was slapped onto the listing, and a few more folks appeared to tour the place. Then came the final twist. On a warm Saturday morning, Karen was loading a moving truck with her belongings under the watchful stares of neighbors. Jake noticed her from his porch. She spotted him too, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes locked. Instead of anger, he saw bitterness and maybe regret. She disappeared into the house, only to re-emerge holding a spray can. Before anyone could react, she darted across the property line and scrawled a hateful message on the fence, "Prying eyes here." The irony was thick. After all, she'd been the one drilling holes. But the act was undeniably malicious. Gasps rippled among the neighbors who witnessed it. Jake's heart dropped. Just when he thought it was over, she'd found one last destructive way to leave her mark. Karen fled the scene as quickly as she'd appeared, jumping into her car and speeding off, leaving the half-loaded truck behind. A friend or relative must have stayed behind to finish the packing. The bold graffiti glistened in the sunlight, an eyesore and a final testament to her grudge. However, Jake discovered that his camera had once again captured the incident in crisp detail. After all, it still covered that fence line. He had conclusive proof of her vandalism. He passed it along to the HOA, and they promptly slapped her with the largest fine yet, which legally carried over to her final settlement. The new owners, upon hearing the story, requested that the cost of fence repairs be covered by Karen at closing. She had no choice but to comply or risk a lawsuit. In one last stroke of poetic justice, the cost to repaint and restore the fence ballooned due to rush fees. Karen effectively paid extra for her own petty sabotage. A day later, she was gone for good. When the dust settled and the "for sale" sign was replaced with "sold," the neighborhood exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Jake wasted no time repainting the fence, meticulously erasing any trace of Karen's angry scrawl. He added a small plaque on the inside of his yard that read, "Boundaries Matter." It reminded him daily of the bizarre, stressful, and at times almost comedic ordeal he'd endured. The new owners turned out to be a friendly couple who introduced themselves the moment they stepped onto the property. Jake felt an immediate sense of ease. No more holes, no more creeping silhouettes with drills. Once the neighbors got wind of Karen's permanent departure, a sense of levity spread through the block. People organized a low-key barbecue as a nod to moving past the drama. Stories circulated. Some folks joked that they should mount the drilled fence plank in a community museum as a cautionary tale. Looking back, Jake realized how a single hole in a fence had unraveled the illusion that everyone in suburbia naturally respected each other. The fiasco tested his patience, cost him sleep, and nearly drowned him in paperwork. Yet, it also underscored the importance of standing firm when someone violates your personal space. With Karen's final sabotage ironically hitting her own wallet the hardest, the episode ended with a surprising moment of satisfaction. Yes, the fence bore the scars of vandalism, but it also stood as a quiet monument to having weathered a storm. Now, whenever Jake glanced over at the sturdy boards, all smooth and secure, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of relief and triumph. He had stared down a neighbor who believed fences were optional, that privacy was negotiable, and he won. Surrounded by the gentle hum of normalcy, he breathed easy, confident that no prying eyes lurked beyond the wooden planks any longer.